issues like purpose and meaning in life, and being kind and having gratitude, which you can't really measure, which I think have more power than, I think obviously exercise and diet and sleep and and stress reduction are, extremely important, but it's these intangibles like having purpose that I've seen in my patients probably be more important.
Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to take a minute to talk about Kion, an awesome company that provides natural supplements and clean coffee for vibrant health. I've been enjoying their delicious coffee, which is in the top 3% of all coffee grown worldwide that can claim to be specialty grade. Their beans are tested by an accredited global organization to ensure that they're free from yeast, pesticides, mold, and mycotoxins. Kion coffee is ethically sourced, it's roasted to maximize health and flavor, and packaged for freshness. To get 15% off your order of Kion coffee or any of their products and supplements, visit getkion.com, that's getkion.com/Dan Voss, and enter code DANVOSS, that's DANVOSS, at checkout for 15% off your order. You're listening to the Live Life Longer show with Dan Voss, where we discuss longevity, anti-aging practices, having more energy, and living a happier, healthier life. My guest today is Dr. Frank Lipman, who is a vocal pioneer of integrative and functional medicine, or what he calls good medicine. Dr. Lipman is the founder of 1111 Wellness Center and the chief medical officer at The Well. He's a sought-after international speaker and best-selling author of 6 books, including his latest book, The New Rules of Aging Well, a simple program for immune resilience, strength, and vitality. Dr. Lipman, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Hi, Dan.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation and talking about your new book, The New Rules of Aging Well, and getting more into anti-aging practices and what we can be doing for longevity. It's something I like to talk a lot about on my podcast. The name of the show is the Live Life Longer Show. So to have you on as a guest, I think it's going to really resonate well with my audience. So I'd like to start off learning a little bit more about the guests that I have on and having you share kind of your story of how you got into to medicine, functional medicine. I understand you grew up in South Africa. So maybe you can kind of share a little bit more about that backstory of how you first got interested into medicine and really finding new ways that people can heal and look at health in a different way.
Sure. So I got into medicine. I just fell into it because I came from a medical family, and my brother went to medical school, so I just went to medical school. I didn't really think about it. That's what kids who got into medical school did. I wasn't even particularly interested in medical school. In fact, I failed my first 2 years. I was doing too many drugs and partying and not taking medical school too seriously. But I only really got interested in medicine when I qualified, or towards the end of my medical training. And part of that was because I was working in South Africa when I was growing up. When I went to medical school in the 70s, there was still apartheid there, and apartheid means separate. Everything was separate. You had whites living in certain areas and blacks living in certain areas. You had, whites and blacks went to different schools. Whites and blacks had different hospitals that they went to. And I was always intrigued by African culture. I came from a very left-wing home, and I was very interested in the different cultures and in different African music. So after my, and I always, during my training, worked in the black hospitals, because you had to choose where you're going to work. It was either a white hospital or a black hospital. And it was there when I first started coming into contact with sangomas, or traditional healers. And what I noticed was that when we couldn't help patients, sometimes the family would call in the traditional healer and they would help the patient. I didn't really think much about it because, I was brainwashed by my medical training and I thought everything else was nonsense. But after I finished my internship, I went to work in the bush for 18 months. And once again, I came in contact with these Sangomas, traditional healers. And there I actually paid a little bit more attention because I was working more closely with them. And once again, I realized that, sometimes when we couldn't help patients, they were helping patients. So that's sort of opened my mind to a different way of thinking. And then, I'd always wanted to leave South Africa. I didn't want to live under apartheid. So I had to study for my American exams. And while I was studying for the exams to get in here, I worked at a practice in white suburbia. So it was a white practice. But it was also a very alternative sort of, the doctor looked after all the political detainees and the lefties and the arts community. And when there were a lot of people coming in who hadn't been helped by Western medicine, but they'd been to a homeopathy was big there. They'd been to the one acupuncturist, and they were coming in and they were, telling me that their headaches got helped or the irritable bowel got helped by homeopathy or acupuncture. And these were things that I couldn't help with Western medicine. So it started opening up my mind to, wow, there's got to be other ways of thinking about this. And, long story short, I emigrated to America and I had to do a residency to get a license in New York. And I got a job in the South Bronx, which was a burnt out area in those days. And they sponsored me for a green card and I started my internal medicine training. And after a few weeks, I was very disillusioned with Western medicine because it was very different. There was no interaction didn't really have to take a good history or speak to people. It was all about blood tests and x-ray results and reading up about the patient and presenting it to the professor. There was no interaction. Didn't have to spend time and take a good history and talk to people. So I said to my wife, this is not what I want to do. And I was very disillusioned. And there happened to be an acupuncture clinic, which was doing acupuncture detox at the hospital. So I thought, oh, well, let me go check it out. And this was 1984. I went to check it out and fell in love with acupuncture. So that's how it all started. I mean, I can go on and on and on. It'll take up the whole podcast, but I started getting interested in acupuncture. And during my residency, I was spending time at the acupuncture clinic and time at the hospital. And I noticed there and then that Western medicine was crisis care medicine. It was very good at treating acute heart attacks and broken bones, but not very good at treating chronic problems. And I was going to the acupuncture clinic and it was the opposite. They weren't particularly good at treating crisis care problems, but they were pretty good at helping people with fatigue and irritable bowel and headaches. So, I realized in 1984 that the future of medicine would be some combination of these two. And that's sort of what I call good medicine. And my journey then went on to study meditation and yoga and nutrition and functional medicine. And now I practice a combination of all the above.
Yeah, and I think to have that vision back in that time period of the 80s, to see the field of medicine maybe going that way and being right about it, is pretty neat for you to see that and see where medicine is heading and kind of be spot on really with it. Is pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I don't think medicine was heading in that. I just knew it. I just knew the truth. It was, it wasn't a visionary. I just saw what was obvious, and I just went with, I think knowing that growing up in South Africa, when you know that the system is rotten and you don't trust the system, it was sort of easier for me just not to trust the It was another system that I wasn't trusting, so it was easy for me.
Sure. Fascinating. So what prompted you to write your new book, The New Rules of Aging Well? What is it about longevity that you think is missing right now?
Well, actually what prompted me was the publisher asked me to, because I'd done a book with them, which was a bestseller, and they wanted to write another book. and they said, "You interested in writing another book?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually quite intrigued by aging because I'm aging. I'm 66, and I've been doing a lot of research into aging, and I see there's some interesting stuff coming out. There's a lot of research on longevity genes and on longevity gene regulators." I said, "Well, I'll do one on aging because that's what I'm particularly interested in, and we do it in my practice. We've been doing more and more around helping people age better." So that's how the book came about. I wasn't even thinking of writing a book on aging. It just, they said, they want to do another book, and I said, "Well, this is what I'm into." And they said, "This is great. Let's do it."
There's a lot there with the topic of aging. It's something that I'm learning about. Every week I'm having these podcast interviews and learning more about anti-aging practices and longevity. So it's definitely a fascinating topic. What would you say are some of the things that you learned while writing this book that you're most excited about in this field of anti-aging?
Well, I think most important, it confirmed a lot of what I've been doing and, what I've learned, what I've been teaching for many years, this combining of this old wisdom, meditation and sleep and fasting and temperature extremes, a lot of practices that many cultures have been doing for centuries. And what I've always done is taken that wisdom into all of my books and all of my practices, and then combining it with sort of the new research that's coming out on various things. And there just happened to be a lot of new research on these longevity genes and how you can optimize function a little bit more. And there was this more interesting stuff happening around self-measurement and tracking, and then the whole biohacking world, which is a whole nother story. But so I thought, just combining everything that I'm sort of doing in my life and in my practice and putting it into a book. So it was sort of just a continuation of what I've been doing, which I've always sort of used myself as a guinea pig in my patients, and so it was sort of just an extension of what I've been doing. I've always tried to keep people healthy and well, and
Sure.
What is longevity? It's sort of staying. Your podcast is called Living
The Live Life Longer show.
Live Life. It should be Live Life Healthier show. So so what I try to do is try and increase people's health spans, how long they stay healthy. And
I was just going to mention that it's I named it the Live Life Longer show, and of course I'm going for longevity, but I think we all oftentimes we miss out on health span, and in that idea of living healthy, right, but in those longer years, and I think that's sometimes missed.
Yeah, and I think it's always the selfish thing. My books often are sort of what I've been exploring and doing, and I just then take a lot of this information, make it simple for people, and put it out there. And when you get to my age, I'm a grandfather now. It becomes a little bit more urgent on how you look after yourself, because you want to. I want to see my grandson grow up and get married and see his children. So these things become a little bit more urgent and personal than as when you get older. So that's sort of what it's about.
That's funny. It's something I was planning on talking about a few questions away from right now, but since you brought it up, I might as well go there. Why is it important to have purpose, when it relates to longevity? It sounds like a big purpose for you is to live long enough to see your grandkids grow up and get married and enjoy that time with them. What is it about purpose?
Well, I think purpose is probably one of the most important factors in not only aging well, but in health in general. And I think I've talked about purpose probably in most of my books. It's these sort of intangible issues like purpose and meaning in life, and being kind and having gratitude, which you can't really measure, which I think have more power than, I think obviously exercise and diet and sleep and stress reduction are, extremely important. But it's these intangibles like having purpose that I've seen in my patients probably be more important. So I always talk about purpose, and I always believe that purpose is important. I see it in myself and in friends and patients, that people who have purpose and have meaning in their lives and just tend to do better. So purpose, I think, is, and purpose can be, as I said, it could be my grandson. It could be trying to turn people on to healthier ways of living. It can be trying to change the climate, trying to change the politics of a country. Your purpose is a personal thing, but it doesn't have to be a huge change or that you want to create. It can be as simple as wanting to have your children and grandchildren grow up healthy.
Yeah.
So you just got to find something that's meaningful to you and that turns you on.
I love that outlook of simplicity. I think you could probably even go as simple as, you want to live long enough to, wake up every morning and read your favorite book. It can be something as simple as a hobby, and sometimes people think purpose has to be this big, grandiose mission to change the whole world. It doesn't always have to be that way. So
not at all. Absolutely. I mean, as long as your purpose is meaningful to you and it gives, it's your purpose, that's all that's what it's all about.
That's right. In terms of, anti-aging or just the idea of aging, what are some common myths that you have discovered in writing this book that you're seeing quite a bit?
Common myths. Well, I think I don't know about myths, but what I see as maybe it's not really a myth, but where people go wrong is because there's so much technology out there, and there's so much information out on biohacking and self-improvement. People get so, what I call, yang about it, very masculine, and I think they get so obsessive about it and obsessed about it that it becomes more of a stress. For instance, like they track their sleep, and if they don't sleep, they're not sleeping properly, they get all pissed off and angry that they're not sleeping properly. So I think, people need to loosen up a little bit about, some people, not everyone, obviously, depends on your personality. But I think that I wouldn't say it's a myth, but I do see people trying a little bit too hard. I think, especially as you get older, I think there's an acceptance that we're all getting older, and, you are going to have a few more aches and pains, and you're not going to be perfect. And you get used to, and I think it's a really good idea to be able to laugh at yourself and don't take yourself so seriously. So I think taking oneself too seriously and getting healthy and trying to live to 120 too seriously, I think, is probably not a good thing for a lot of people. What other myths? There's a myth that there's one way for everyone. There is no one way for every, for some people. I see you got a dog. I love dogs. For some,
she's barking hard right now.
That's fine.
It's almost dinner time for her.
I mean, dogs can be very healing. So I think, there's, the myth of you have to do everything perfectly, and you have to sleep 8 hours, and you have to exercise every day, and you have to eat this type of diet. I don't think rigidity is the way to go. I think being able to adapt is probably more important. So for some people, having a dog can be more healing than exercising hard every day. So I think there's just not the myth of these are the things you have to do, and you're going to live to 120 is not going to be right.
I think having a dog is healing until she starts barking throughout your entire podcast.
Yeah, but just go with it. That's a dog. I love dogs. Yeah.
No, that's great. So I think what you're getting at, the overall kind of message I'm hearing is that we can simplify things. It doesn't always have to be overly complex. And to your point, that often makes it more stressful when we try to focus on all these different, biometrics and biohacking and tracking every little thing.
Yep.
It can oftentimes add some stress.
It does too, and that's probably the biggest issue. Because I see all types of patients, including serious biohackers, and that would be the biggest issue I see with certain, especially men. Everything has to be. They want their number exactly here, and they get a little bit too obsessive about it, which becomes stressful because when it's not perfect, and nothing's, life isn't perfect.
That's right. I also understand you've talked about the idea of forgiveness and how that might help out, with living longer. I was actually just listening to a talk. It was a Mind Valley talk. I think it was yesterday, about forgiveness, and they mentioned there's some research that was done that showed people that forgave whatever it was that was holding them back from the past, whether it was forgiving somebody else or forgiving themselves. They actually were able to jump higher. They did a series of studies of people, and they found that they could actually jump higher after going through that process of forgiveness. So what are you seeing there with forgiveness in terms of longevity?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say specifically in terms of longevity, but, I saw forgiveness was something that was very instrumental in the whole South African experiment when Mandela came out of prison, and what he said was like just really hit me hard. And then I had quite a bit of interaction with Bishop Tutu as well. He was involved with the nonprofit I'm involved with, and what Mandela said when he came out of prison. It's the classic story. He comes out of prison and he sees his prison guard on the other side of the fence, and this anger swelled up inside of him, and he caught himself. And he said to himself, if he can't forgive him and he can't let go of that anger, he would still be a prisoner. And Bishop Tutu always used to say, when you forgive, it benefits you more than whoever you forgive. And so, I just think it's something that's very hard for most of us, especially in Western culture. But, if you are able to forgive and let go, when you can't forgive and that anger stays inside of you, it festers. So I think, this is, what I was talking about earlier, the intangibles. This not being able to forgive, getting angry easily, all these little issues that are very hard to measure. It's easy to measure your sleep and what happens to your pulse with exercise, or, we can do blood tests, and there's certain things that are measurable and you can track, but it's very difficult to measure these intangibles like forgiveness and kindness and gratitude and meaning in life. And to me, the older I get, I believe these issues are probably definitely as important, and maybe even more important than the standard, the four standards we look at: diet, exercise, stress reduction, and sleep.
Yeah, I think the idea of just having compassion is something that we need, especially in today's world, in today's Western world, and everything going on right now is definitely something that we can all use more of.
Right.
So I think I'd like to get more into, we've talked about those intangibles. I'd like to now kind of shift a little bit more to, nutrition and microbiome and our gut. What is it about, our microbiome, in terms of listening to our gut and how that relates to aging?
Right. Well, as I always say, if you want to age-proof your life, you need to leak-proof your gut. So, we know that inflammation is probably one of the commonest underlying factor in aging. In most chronic diseases, there's always what we call a downstream factor of inflammation. So inflammation is usually the issue in most aging processes, in most chronic diseases. There's inflammation there. And the commonest source of inflammation is the gut. We talk about anti-aging, anti-inflammatory foods and pro-inflammatory foods. And yes, that's the case. But the main source of your inflammation comes from the gut if you've got a leaky gut. So I would assume your listeners know what a leaky gut, but if if you don't know what a leaky gut is, you do get some damage to the gut lining, which is very, very thin. And remember, the gut lining is your barrier to the external world, and that gets damaged easily, and the tight junctions between the cells can loosen. And that often happens when there's an altered microbiome, and we get an altered microbiome quite easily with the way we live our lives these days, with the types of foods we eat, the too many antibiotics we take, which carpet bomb our guts, the PPIs and other medications. So we get damage to the gut wall, and then we have metabolites of some bacteria, we have toxins, we have breakdown of food products that actually go through these tight junctions when it's a little bit what we call leaky, when the wall is a bit permeable, and it goes into our bloodstream and triggers inflammation. And the inflammation can affect all parts of your body. So to me, leak-proofing your gut is probably one of the most important things you can do for aging, because it'll decrease the amount of inflammation.
Okay. So what can we be doing to achieve a healthy gut? What are some things that we should be avoiding, and what foods should we focus more on?
Sure. So the biggest foods are the sugars, the starches. Gluten is a huge, huge problem. Now, there's a test that I do in my office called the wheat zoomer, which measures 13 different antigens to gluten, because it's not in celiac test, they just measure, I think, 3 or 4, but there are all these different antigens, and almost everyone I test, it actually has some sensitivity to 1 or 2 at least of the antigens, and then it can actually measure if they have some intestinal permeability. And a lot of people, if not most, have either the beginnings or some intestinal permeability. So I think sugar, starches, and gluten would be the foods up there, but if you sensitive, some people are sensitive to dairy. I mean, that's not everyone, but grains can be a problem. And then I think factory farm meats are a big problem because of all the antibiotics in there, which can affect the microbiome. And then one issue that's not discussed often enough, but I would imagine on your show has been discussed, is the glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. But it's not just on genetically modified organisms. Glyphosate is sprayed on most grains and beans in America to help the drying process. And glyphosate also happens to be a registered antibiotic. So, and it's permeated the American food system. So we have a problem where a lot of the foods we're eating, so the glyphosate that's sprayed on all these grains, and then the sugar and the starches and the gluten, and then artificial sweeteners can affect your microbiome. Artificial ingredients can affect your microbiome. So you really got to be very careful with what you eat, because over time that will affect this microbiome and then affect the lining of the gut. So those would be, I mean, I know it sounds drastic to a lot of people, but those would be the foods to avoid as much as possible. I mean, you don't have to be perfect, but if you're sensitive to gluten, sometimes you do need to be fairly perfect. But for the most part, you need to cut back on those foods as much as possible. And then the foods to eat, varies, because if someone's got an altered microbiome, sometimes fermented foods actually make it a little bit worse. Not that fermented foods are bad for you. Fermented foods are good bacteria. But if you have an overgrowth of yeast, for instance, and you have fermented foods, it makes it worse. It makes you get more gas. So I tend to encourage people to eat prebiotics, which are actually the fiber that you don't digest, and then that feeds the good bacteria. So I always talk about, eating the stalks and stems. So the part of the broccoli or asparagus that you normally throw away, eat those because your body's not going to break them down properly. So that feeds the bacteria. Sometimes a probiotic, sometimes fermented foods help, but as I said, sometimes it doesn't. And, just eat a clean diet. Eat as close to nature as possible. It's the altered foods that tend to be a problem. So if you are going to eat meat, eat grass-fed, grass-finished meat. If you're going to eat, eggs or chicken, eat organic, farm pastured eggs and pastured chickens, and try get organic vegetables. I know it's not practical for everyone, but ewg.org, Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, has a nice list of the most of the vegetables with the most pesticides on and the ones with the least. There are ways of getting around it, and I talk about it all in all my books. So it's easy information to get.
Yeah, I think everything you mentioned there, those are really good universal kind of truths when it comes to nutrition. And I know something you've said before that it's not like there's one specific diet for everybody. It's something that you, in a way, have to experiment with certain foods to see what works with you and what doesn't. Because we're not all going to be eating the same food across the board.
Right. So I used to eat a more of a paleo animal protein heavy diet. Because I did well with it. I was pre-diabetic years ago from eating tons of grains and fruits, and so I switched to a paleo diet, and my numbers reversed, and I felt so much better, and that was great. And then I started researching aging, and there's quite a bit of research about MTOR, which maybe your readers probably have heard about. It's one of the longevity gene regulators, and how you want this protein complex of mTOR to, when you're young, you want it because it's about growth and getting strong and reproducing. But when you get older, you don't want that mTOR to be stimulated. And animal protein is one of those things that's stimulated. So someone like you, animal protein is great. Someone like me, I have cut down. It's not that I've stopped, but I don't have animal protein 2 meals a day. I have animal protein, maybe 1 meal a day, probably 1 meal every second day.
What is it about the mTOR that is not good for older folks? I'm sorry if I missed that.
Yeah, so, mTOR is a protein complex that actually stimulates growth and reproduction. And so when you're older, you don't want too much cellular growth because it's going to cause too much waste product, and our cleansing mechanisms decrease when we grow older. So you don't want too much cellular growth because it can end up growing cancer. So that's a fine balance. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat animal protein, because the problem becomes, the tricky part becomes, as you get older and you start losing muscle mass, the best thing for muscle mass is actually animal protein. So it's a fine balance. But the point is, I think from eating maybe 2 meals of animal protein a day, I've eat maybe one a day or one every second day. I mean, I only eat 2 meals a day anyway, so it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
So that eating less is probably one of the best things you can do as you get older too, and that's good for mTOR. The mTOR. When you're eating a lot and you're growing, your mTOR is in full throttle, which is great when you're younger, but you don't want it in full throttle when you're older. So fasting is good, eating less is good, and definitely eating less protein, and definitely carbs as well. I mean, carbs, sugar and starches. So you adjust. It's not
Sure.
There's no one way. You got to find what works for you.
Sure. You must have read my mind, because I was just about to ask about fasting. What type of fasting do you practice, and what kinds of fasting do you like to recommend? Of course, it depends on each person and their own individual goals.
Sure.
But what are your thoughts there?
My thoughts are the easiest way to do it is, eat dinner earlier and breakfast later is what I talk about. So I personally do that. I don't eat for a good 16 hours. So I'll normally have dinner by 6:30 the latest, occasionally 7, but anyway, around 6 or 7. And then my breakfast will be around 10 to 11 the next day. I'll have a cup of black coffee in the morning, and which doesn't seem to be a problem. So that's what I do, and that's the easiest way to do it. I'm not saying that's the only way to do it. There's the 5-2 diet. There's some people do once a week. Some people do week fast. There's a fasting mimicking diet where you eat this, no animal protein, low calorie diet for 5 days a month. I mean, there are different ways. They all seem to give you very similar benefits. And, we measure markers in my office, and we seem to see very similar results with all types of fasting on people's lipid profiles and blood sugars, etc. So there definitely is no one way to do it. The most convenient is the way I do it. I'm not saying it's the best. I mean, probably if you're going to do what I do and you can do it, it's probably better to skip dinner and not break. And in other words, eat your last meal around 2 or 3 o'clock, because that will fit into your body's rhythms and when your digestion peaks. So that would probably be ideal, but that's harder for most people because dinner's usually a communal dinner and you're eating with your spouse or your family. So it's you've got to fit these changes into your family, your lifestyle and your life in general. So I think you've got to find what works for you. But I think time restricted eating, let's call it that, is just a good practice. And the other part of it, you eat less. When I just eat less now.
Yep.
So
yeah, it sounds like we're on a similar eating window there. I usually have my first meal around 11, maybe noon, and then I have dinner around 6 or so. And in the beginning, it was tough. I remember those first 2 weeks of like skipping breakfast or having a much later breakfast was pretty hard because I went my whole life eating as soon as I woke up, which most Americans do.
Yep.
And then when you think about that, people are eating from, let's say, 8 a.m. all the way up until they go to bed at 9 or 10 p.m.
Yeah, which is sort of what I do. I think most people, I used to believe and teach that we need to eat 5 small meals a day to keep your blood sugar stable.
Yeah.
So this was a big revelation for me, and it's so easy. I feel so much better. It's actually so easy to do. It's like
it is, and it's incredible for me the energy that I have and the mental clarity I have. I don't have that like fogginess or even that like the fatigue that I usually had around like 2 or 3 p.m.
Yeah,
it all went away, which is pretty remarkable. Excellent. There's a few other topics I want to cover here. There's one topic that you covered in your book quite a bit, that for some maybe was surprising, for others maybe not, but you talked about CBD and mushrooms. So I'd like to cover a little bit what your thoughts are on CBD use and mushrooms and how that can help with health overall, but as well as aging.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, CBD, THC, CBD, CBN, CBG, there's all different strains now. I think the cannabinoids are just interesting, what are they? Herbs or whatever you want to call it, substances, because they affect so many different pathways. And, in New York State, we're not allowed to use THC, but I have so many patients from around the country and friends who swear by, who over the years have just been telling me about, how effective. I always saw, I smoked a lot of pot when I was younger, and to me, pot was just this thing to get high, and I didn't see any medical benefits from it, really.
Sure.
I didn't know there were. And then once I started hearing from a lot of people I respected, I started researching it and realizing this is interesting stuff. And so I use CBD a lot in my practice for mainly for sleep and for relaxation, sometimes for pain. I mean, those are the three main uses. And I've seen really interesting results. And sleep and stress are two major issues that affect people's aging. So, if you I have CBD next to my bed. Like if I have to give a talk at 8 and I'm still revved up, I just, throw some of the CBD liquid down just to calm down, and just, because I'm so hyperactive. So I think it's pretty benign, and it's quite powerful in just calming down the nervous system. I don't use THC so much because we can't in New York, but I know people who swear by, with the THC, it's the indica part as opposed to the sativa part that is more relaxing. And I have patients who get it from wherever who tell me how they balance the indica. I mean, it's quite an art, and I've just seen incredible results. So I'm a huge fan. And it's sort of relatively benign. So it's sort of new to my armory of what I use. I don't know if it's anti-aging, but I think they're very interesting substances. Mushrooms I've been using for ages. Mushrooms. I got taught about mushrooms in Chinese medicine, and I've been using mushrooms for a long, long time. And then what really got me more interested in them, I had a health coach who was just a young superstar, and her father got pancreatic cancer. And she stopped her work and everything and went to live with him and helped him get better. And one of the major things, she used a lot of THC and CBD, was mushrooms. So she sort of got me more interested in mushrooms. But I've been using mushrooms for years, but now with researching the book, I started maybe using a little bit of lion's mane, for instance, for cognition. But I just think mushrooms are once again another product from the earth that there's more and more research on that can be helpful for many different things, and most cultures have sort of been using mushrooms for various things. So are they anti-aging? I take mushrooms every day, and especially now with COVID, but and I use them a lot in my practice, not necessarily for anti-aging per se, but to me, anti-aging is just keeping people healthy.
Right.
And one of the other aspects of cannabinoids are that they're anti-inflammatory too. So is that helping? Maybe.
It's been interesting to see, especially in the U.S., some of that cultural shift of that stigma really being removed, of it being bad and still illegal in certain parts of the country, at least federally it is. But it has been fascinating to see the research coming out of some of the health benefits, specifically with CBD and THC and mushrooms, is something that I think has been talked about quite a bit, especially in the U.S. I would say in the last 5 years or so, with new research coming out that's being done, showing some really fascinating stuff there.
Yeah, and there's even now more and more research on psychedelics for depression. And so it's interesting what's happening. I mean, I'm loving seeing all of this because it just makes sense.
Yeah, well, especially with mushrooms and psychedelics specifically, as you've mentioned, that's medicine that has been used for centuries. Yeah. And I don't necessarily know the history or know enough about, within, the U.S. over the decades, the history there of the legality of it and the stigma of it all. But if you look back at the history of it, hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, people have been using this for the benefit for a very long time. So it's interesting just to kind of see that kind of surface again.
Yep.
Very good. I have a few other things I'd like to cover, and I want to be respectful of your time. But in terms of exercise, do you have a specific routine that you like to follow? Has that kind of changed over the years? what are your thoughts with exercise as it relates to aging?
Yeah, I think look, exercise is one of those keys, and I should probably exercise more, but I tend to be lazy. But I do. I have I'm a big cyclist, not a big one,
Cool.
but I cycle a lot. So in the winter, when it's cold, I have a Peloton, and when it's warmer, I go outside. I prefer going outside, but
Mm,
I love my Peloton now too because I'm able to now cycle inside.
sure.
So I do interval training. So whether it's on my Peloton or even on my bike, my routes tend to have hills.
Mm,
Um, so, the idea about, which is an important concept, which I'm sure you've probably talked about, is this concept of hormesis.
hmm
Hormesis is a little bit of stress is good for the body. So fasting has hormetic effects because your body is not getting food. So it's a little bit of a stress on your body. Going from hot to cold or an extreme heat like a sauna or
Yep.
cold plunges have a hormetic effect. And interval training, when you push yourself, has a hormetic effect. So I do intervals on my bike. When the weather's great, my wife and I go for walks as well.
Mm.
I need to do more strength training. I'm lazy, but it's important. I just, because muscle is a metabolic organ.
Mm.
Um, so if there's one of the things that I need to improve is doing strength training.
Yep.
What I also want to talk about exercise is, we all know about interval training and strength training. I do feel stretching, or I used to do a lot of yoga until I came off my bike and I broke my wrist. But I do think stretching is really important. And there's just been a study that came out talking about how important stretching is for high blood pressure. And my yoga teacher studied under Mr. Iyengar, an older who died, in the last couple of years, about how important yoga. He had a whole clinic, a cardiac clinic, where he treated cardiac patients with yoga. So I think stretching and yoga are really, really important and shouldn't be ignored. And releasing your fascia. People get tight fascias and have tight muscles, and if you don't free that up, it's going to cause problems. So exercises or taking care of your musculoskeletal system should be part of exercise.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely an important thing. Another kind of like outlook I like to have on when it comes to exercise for me, especially this year, is just incorporating into my lifestyle. Going for more walks. Now I have my dogs. I'm walking a lot more. And just doing, smaller amounts of exercise throughout the day,
Yes.
rather than going to the gym and having, a soul crushing workout for an hour or two. You
uh,
kind of build it into your lifestyle instead.
I think that's probably more important. I'm not saying going to the gym is not important, but I think
Right.
building movement. I always talk about that.
Yep.
Building movement into your days is actually more important. So yes, I agree 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Where can people find more about you, Dr. Lipman? You have a website, you're on social media?
Yeah. drfranklipman.com. I have a website. We have a free newsletter, a lot of great information. I'm on Twitter, Dr. Frank Lipman. I have Instagram. I don't do it, but my health coach does it. I think it's Frank Lipman, MD. What else? But the big thing, yeah, my books and my website. And, we still see patients in my office. We do a lot of virtuals now. I have a great team. We do a lot of longevity medicine now. We do genetic testing, microbiome testing when necessary, but a lot of biomarkers. So I think we're incorporating all the new science and research and combining it with these old tried and true ways of helping people get better.
Mm, that's
And
fantastic.
personalizing it is what the future is. So, because what we do with you is different to what we do with someone else. So
Sure.
that's the future.
That's great. I'll have all of that linked up in the description here, your website link and social media profiles,
Perfect.
and your new book. Be sure to check out The New Rules of Aging Well. It's fascinating stuff. It's a topic, that I'm very passionate about, and I know my listeners are as well. So thank you,
Yeah,
Dr. Lipman.
and I think people need to realize it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to. You just try change a habit at a time, and it's never too late to start.
I love that. I love it. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Okay.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye.